David Richardson adjusted his tie one last time as he walked out of the university auditorium. His daughter Lisa had just graduated summa cum laude from law school, and his chest swelled with pride. The ceremony had been everything he hoped for. 3 years of late nights studying, countless phone calls where she doubted herself, and now she was officially a lawyer. "Dad, thank you for everything," Lisa had whispered when she hugged him after the ceremony. Those words meant more to him than any case he had ever won. Now driving his black BMW sedan through the quiet suburban streets, David couldn't stop smiling. The radio played softly in the background as he thought about calling his wife to share every detail of the day. She had wanted to come, but their youngest son had a soccer tournament that same afternoon. Family always came first in the Richardson household. The speedometer showed he was going exactly 35 millimeters in the 35 millimeter zone. After 20 years as a federal prosecutor, David had developed habits that kept him on the right side of every law. He checked his mirrors regularly, used turn signals even when no one was around, and never exceeded speed limits. Old habits from his days as a young lawyer, when he couldn't afford even a simple traffic ticket. That's why the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror caught him completely off guard. David pulled over immediately, his hands automatically moving to the 10-2 position on the steering wheel. He rolled down his window and waited. The afternoon sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the residential street lined with well-maintained houses and manicured lawns. 2 officers approached his vehicle. The first one, a tall man with graying temples, walked up to the driver's side. His partner, younger with a stern expression, positioned himself near the passenger side of the car. "License and registration," the older officer said without any greeting. "Of course, officer," David replied politely. "May I ask what this is about?" "You were speeding." David felt confused but remained calm. "I don't believe I was speeding, sir. I was going exactly the speed limit." The officer's expression hardened. "Are you arguing with me?" "No, sir. I'm just trying to understand what happened." David reached slowly into his glove compartment for his registration and pulled out his wallet for his license. He had done this routine before, though it had been years since his last traffic stop. The officer studied the documents for what seemed like an unusually long time. "Step out of the vehicle." This request surprised David. In his experience, routine traffic stops didn't require drivers to exit their cars unless there were serious concerns. "Is that necessary, officer? I'm happy to cooperate, but I'd like to understand why." "Step out of the vehicle now," the officer repeated, his hand moving closer to his belt. David's training as a prosecutor kicked in. He knew his rights, but he also knew that challenging police officers on the street rarely ended well. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Turn around and put your hands on the car." "Officer, I think there might be some misunderstanding here," David said as he complied. "I wasn't speeding and I've been completely cooperative." The younger officer spoke for the first time. "You're being argumentative and suspicious." David felt a chill run down his spine. 20 years in federal court had taught him to recognize when a situation was spiraling out of control. These officers seemed determined to escalate rather than de-escalate. "I'm not trying to be argumentative," David said carefully. "I'm just trying to understand what's happening." The older officer began patting him down, checking his pockets with unnecessary roughness. "What's this?" he said, feeling David's phone in his jacket pocket. "That's my cell phone. Don't reach for anything," the officer warned as David instinctively moved his hand. David froze. "I wasn't reaching for anything. You asked what it was." By now, a few neighbors had come out to their porches to watch. David noticed an elderly woman across the street recording with her phone. He felt grateful for the witnesses but also embarrassed. Here he was, a respected federal prosecutor, being treated like a criminal in broad daylight. "I'm going to need you to take your phone out slowly," the older officer said. David reached into his pocket with deliberate, slow movements. As he pulled out his phone, he had an idea. Maybe he should record this interaction. As a prosecutor, he knew how valuable video evidence could be. "I'd like to record this encounter," David said, holding up his phone. Both officers immediately tensed up. "Put that phone away right now," the younger officer shouted. "Sir, I have the right to record police interactions in public," David replied, his prosecutor training taking over. That's when everything went wrong. "He's reaching for something," the younger officer yelled. Before David could process what was happening, both officers had drawn their weapons and were pointing them directly at him. "Drop the phone. Get on the ground now." David's heart pounded as he found himself staring down the barrels of 2 police pistols. The phone fell from his hands and clattered onto the asphalt. This couldn't be happening, not here. Not to him. "I'm not resisting," David said, raising his hands high above his head. "I'm cooperating completely. Get on the ground." David slowly lowered himself to his knees, then lay face down on the street. The asphalt was rough against his cheek, and he could taste dust in his mouth. His graduation suit was getting dirty, but that seemed like the least of his concerns now. The officers handcuffed him roughly, the metal cutting into his wrists. David's mind raced. How had a simple traffic stop turned into this? He thought about Lisa, probably celebrating with her friends right now, having no idea what was happening to her father. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest and obstruction of justice," the older officer announced. David almost laughed at the absurdity. Resisting arrest? He had complied with every command. Obstruction of justice? For asking questions and trying to record? As they lifted him to his feet, David made a decision that would change everything. He wouldn't tell them who he was. Not yet. As a federal prosecutor, David had power and influence. One phone call could end this nightmare immediately, but something told him to wait. Maybe it was curiosity about how far this would go. Maybe it was a desire to understand what ordinary citizens experienced when they encountered biased policing. Whatever the reason, David Richardson, United States Attorney for the Eastern District, stayed silent as they loaded him into the back of the police car. He watched his BMW being towed away and wondered if this was how justice really worked when you didn't have a badge and a law degree to protect you. The police car pulled away from the quiet suburban street, leaving behind only a cell phone on the asphalt and a group of concerned neighbors who couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. The county jail smelled like disinfectant mixed with something David couldn't quite identify. As the heavy metal doors clanged shut behind him, he realized he was about to experience a side of the justice system he had only read about in case files. Sergeant Williams sat behind the booking desk, barely looking up from his paperwork when David was brought in. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered, casting harsh shadows across the institutional green walls. "Empty your pockets," Sergeant Williams said in a bored tone. David complied, placing his wallet, keys, and the few items he had left on the metal counter. The sergeant inventoried everything with mechanical precision, but David noticed something. When a white man in his 50s had been processed just before him, the sergeant had been chatty and even cracked a few jokes. Now, there was only cold efficiency. "Phone call," David said when the processing was nearly complete. "Phone's down," Sergeant Williams replied without looking up. David glanced at the phone on the wall. The red light was clearly indicating it was working. "It looks like it's functioning to me." The sergeant finally looked up, his expression hardening. "I said it's down. You'll get your call when I say you get your call," David bit back his response. In his 20 years as a prosecutor, he had sent hundreds of people through this same system. He had always assumed they were treated fairly during booking. The reality was eye-opening. An hour passed. Then another. David watched as 3 more arrestees came through, all of them white, all of them allowed to make their phone calls immediately. Each time he asked about using the phone, he was told to wait. The systems being updated became the new excuse. Finally, after nearly 3 hours, David was allowed to call his wife. Catherine answered on the first ring. "David? Where are you? Lisa's been calling you for hours." "I'm in county jail," he said quietly into the phone, aware that conversations were often monitored. There was silence on the other end. Catherine was also a lawyer, specializing in civil rights cases. She knew exactly how serious this was. "What happened?" "Traffic stop that went wrong. I'm charged with resisting arrest and obstruction." Catherine's sharp intake of breath was audible. "That's ridiculous. I'm coming down there right now." "No," David said quickly. "Don't use any connections. Don't call anyone we know. I want to see how this plays out." Another pause. Catherine understood immediately. After 15 years of marriage to a federal prosecutor, she knew when he was working on something bigger than the immediate problem. "Are you safe?" "Yes, but I might be here overnight." "I love you," she said. "I love you too. Tell Lisa I'm proud of her and I'll be home soon." After the call, David was led to a holding cell already occupied by 5 other men. The space was designed for maybe 3 people, with one metal bench and a toilet that barely functioned. The air was stale and thick. As his eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, David noticed he was the only black man in a suit. The others wore work clothes or casual outfits. Despite their different backgrounds, they welcomed him with nods and shared the limited space on the bench. "First time?" asked an older man named Robert, who had been picked up for a parole violation. "Yeah," David admitted. "What they get you for?" "Resisting arrest." Robert shook his head knowingly. "Same thing they got me for the first time. 10 years ago. I asked too many questions during a traffic stop." Over the next few hours, David listened to stories that made his blood run cold. Robert told him about being stopped 17 times in 2 years for fitting a description. Carlos, a construction worker, described being arrested for loitering while waiting for the bus after work. Jerome, barely 21, had been charged with disturbing the peace for playing music in his own car. Each story followed a similar pattern: minor interactions with police that escalated quickly, charges that seemed designed to justify the arrests rather than address any real crimes. Time in jail that cost these men their jobs, their housing, sometimes their families. "The system ain't built for people like us," Robert said matter-of-factly. "It's built to keep people like us cycling through." David thought about all the cases he had prosecuted. How many times had he seen these same charges? How many times had he assumed the police reports were accurate and complete? Sitting in this cell, wearing his daughter's graduation suit that was now wrinkled and stained, he began to see those cases differently. Around midnight, a guard brought in another arrestee. This one was different. Clean-cut, well-dressed, clearly from money. He had been arrested for drunk driving, a much more serious charge than anything the other men in the cell faced. Within an hour, the drunk driver was released on his own recognizance. No bail required, just a promise to appear in court. "How does that work?" David asked Robert quietly. "Same way it always works," Robert replied. "Different rules for different people." The night stretched on endlessly. The cell was too crowded for everyone to lie down at once, so they took turns resting, while others stood or sat on the floor. David found himself thinking about every case he had ever prosecuted, wondering how many defendants had spent nights like this before their trials. In the morning, a young woman in a rumpled suit appeared outside the cell. She carried a briefcase that had seen better days and looked like she hadn't slept in a week. "David Richardson?" she called out. David stood up. "That's me. I'm Amy Chen, public defender. I've been assigned to your case." She led him to a small room with a metal table and 2 plastic chairs. The fluorescent light overhead flickered constantly, and there was a stain on the wall that looked like it had been there for years. Amy opened his file and scanned it quickly. Resisting arrest and obstruction of justice. Pretty standard charges. She looked tired and overwhelmed. "The DA is offering a plea deal. 6 months probation, community service, and a fine." 6 months probation for what exactly? David asked. Amy looked surprised by the question. "For the charges you're facing." "But what did I actually do wrong?" Amy sighed. "Look, Mr. Richardson, I'm handling 43 cases right now. The system is overloaded, and fighting these charges usually doesn't work out well for defendants. The officers have body cameras, they have witnesses, and juries tend to believe police testimony." David studied her carefully. Amy seemed like a good person trying to do her best in an impossible situation. She probably graduated from law school with dreams of fighting for justice, only to find herself shuffling people through a system designed for quick processing rather than fair outcomes. "What if I'm innocent?" David asked. "Even innocent people sometimes take plea deals," Amy said sadly. "It's often better than risking a trial and getting a worse sentence." David thought about his daughter Lisa, probably still celebrating her graduation. He thought about all the defendants he had faced across the courtroom over the years. How many of them had sat in rooms like this, facing choices between bad and worse? "I'd like to think about it," David said. Amy nodded. "Your arraignment is this afternoon. Judge Peterson is hearing cases today. He's tough on crime. I'd strongly recommend taking the plea." As Amy packed up her files, David made another decision. He would continue to stay silent about his real identity. He wanted to see Judge Peterson in action when he thought he was dealing with just another defendant who couldn't afford a good lawyer. The guard came to escort David back to the holding cell. As he walked down the hallway, he passed other defendants being led to court. Some looked defiant, others looked defeated. All of them looked like they had learned to expect very little from the system that was supposed to protect them. David Richardson, United States Attorney, was about to get a front-row seat to see how that system really worked. The courtroom looked exactly like dozens of others where David had prosecuted cases over the years. Wood paneling, brass fixtures, and the familiar arrangement of tables where justice was supposed to be served. But sitting in the defendant's chair, wearing an orange jumpsuit that was too big for him, everything felt different. Judge Peterson entered the courtroom with the kind of authority that comes from 20 years on the bench. David recognized him immediately. They had served on the same Bar Association committee 2 years ago and had shared coffee several times during legal conferences. The judge's hair was grayer now and he looked tired, but there was no mistaking the sharp intelligence behind his wire-rimmed glasses. David waited to see if Judge Peterson would recognize him, but the judge barely glanced in his direction. In the orange jumpsuit with a day's worth of stubble and hair that hadn't seen a comb since yesterday morning, David looked like any other defendant waiting for his case to be called. The morning docket was long. David watched case after case move through the system with assembly line efficiency. Judge Peterson's demeanor changed noticeably depending on who stood before him. When Thomas Mitchell, a white businessman charged with embezzlement, appeared with his expensive lawyer, Judge Peterson's voice was measured and respectful. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell. I understand you're requesting a continuance to prepare your defense." Mitchell's lawyer spoke confidently about complex financial records and the need for expert witnesses. Judge Peterson listened patiently and granted a 2-week continuance without hesitation. "Of course, counselor. We want to ensure everyone has adequate time to prepare." The next case was Anthony Washington, a black teenager charged with shoplifting a candy bar worth 99 cents. Anthony stood with the same public defender who had spoken to David earlier, Amy Chen. "Your Honor," Amy began, "my client is 17 years old, has no prior record, and this is a minor offense. We request—" Judge Peterson cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Ms. Chen, shoplifting is theft regardless of the amount. It shows a disrespect for law and property that concerns this court." Anthony's mother sat in the gallery, tears streaming down her face as Judge Peterson sentenced her son to 30 days in juvenile detention plus community service. "This will teach you that actions have consequences, young man." David felt sick watching the contrast. A businessman who had allegedly stolen thousands of dollars got 2 weeks to prepare his defense. A teenager who took a candy bar got 30 days in jail. The pattern continued throughout the morning. White defendants received patience, consideration, and the benefit of the doubt. Black and Latino defendants faced skepticism, interruptions, and harsher sentences for similar or lesser crimes. When Maria Gonzalez appeared for driving without a license, Judge Peterson was visibly annoyed before she even spoke. "Ms. Gonzalez, this is your second offense for driving without proper documentation. Don't you understand that driving is a privilege, not a right?" Maria's court-appointed attorney tried to explain that his client was a single mother, working 2 jobs to support her children, and that she needed to drive to get to work. "Excuses," Judge Peterson said dismissively. 30 days in jail, suspended if she completes community service and pays the fine within 60 days. 20 minutes later, when Kyle Morrison, a white college student, appeared for the same charge, Judge Peterson's tone was completely different. "Mr. Morrison, I see this is your first offense. What happened here?" Kyle's private attorney explained that his client had simply forgotten to renew his license while focusing on his studies. "Well, we all make mistakes," Judge Peterson said with a slight smile. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to give you a warning and a small fine. Make sure you get that license renewed." David was taking mental notes of everything he witnessed. As a prosecutor, he had always focused on presenting his cases and winning convictions. He had never sat through a full docket day just observing. The disparities were impossible to ignore. Finally, his name was called. "David Richardson." David stood up and walked to the defendant's table where Amy Chen was waiting. Judge Peterson glanced at the file in front of him, his expression already showing impatience. "Mr. Richardson, you're charged with resisting arrest and obstruction of justice. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," David said clearly. Judge Peterson looked up from the file, studying David for the first time. Ms. Chen, what's the prosecution offering? District Attorney Foster, a woman David had worked with on several federal cases, stood up. She didn't recognize him either in his current state. Your Honor, Mr. Richardson showed clear disrespect for law enforcement officers. He argued with them, refused to comply with lawful orders, and physically resisted arrest. The state is offering 6 months probation, 100 hours of community service, and a $1,000 fine. Judge Peterson nodded approvingly. That seems reasonable for someone who thinks he can argue with police officers. Amy Chen stood up to respond. Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence. He was simply exercising his constitutional rights during what appears to have been an unlawful traffic stop. Ms. Chen, Judge Peterson's voice was sharp. Are you suggesting that these officers don't know how to do their jobs? No, Your Honor, but the officers have sworn statements indicating that Mr. Richardson was belligerent and threatening. I don't see any reason to doubt their testimony. David noticed that Judge Peterson hadn't even looked at any body camera footage or asked about witness statements. The decision seemed to be made based purely on the police report. Your Honor, Amy tried again. We would like to request a reasonable bail reduction. Mr. Richardson has strong ties to the community and poses no flight risk. Judge Peterson barely considered the request. Individuals who resist police authority demonstrate a fundamental disrespect for law and order. Bail will remain at $5,000. David thought about Kyle Morrison, who had received a warning and a small fine. He thought about Thomas Mitchell, who got 2 weeks to prepare his defense. Here he was, facing charges that everyone in this room should have recognized as questionable, and he was being treated like a career criminal. Furthermore, Judge Peterson continued, I want to make something clear. Mr. Richardson, in my courtroom we respect law enforcement. Police officers put their lives on the line every day to keep our communities safe. When citizens like you make their jobs harder, it makes everyone less safe. David felt the weight of the judge's words. He thought about all the times he had prosecuted cases where defendants claimed police misconduct. How many times had he dismissed those claims because he trusted the system? How many times had judges like Peterson already made up their minds before hearing the evidence? Amy whispered to David, I really think you should consider the plea deal. Judge Peterson clearly believes the officers and juries in this county tend to side with police. David looked around the courtroom. In the gallery, he saw the families of other defendants, mostly people of color, watching their loved ones get processed through a system that seemed designed to find them guilty before they even spoke. He thought about his daughter Lisa, who had just graduated law school with dreams of fighting for justice. What would she think if she could see him now? What would she think about the system she was about to join? Judge Peterson was preparing to move on to the next case when David made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Your Honor, I would like to represent myself in this matter. Amy Chen looked shocked. Mr. Richardson, I strongly advise against that. Pro se defendants rarely. I understand the risks, Counselor, David said calmly, but I believe I can adequately represent myself. Judge Peterson looked annoyed at the delay. Fine, Ms. Chen, you're dismissed. Mr. Richardson, I hope you know what you're doing because this court has no patience for defendants who want to waste time with frivolous motions and conspiracy theories. David stood up straighter. After a day and a half of being treated like he was guilty until proven innocent, after watching justice be dispensed based on skin color and economic status rather than facts and law, he was ready to reveal who he really was, but first, he wanted to hear exactly how far Judge Peterson was willing to go with his predetermined conclusions. Thank you, Your Honor. I look forward to presenting my defense. Judge Peterson shook his head as if David were making a terrible mistake. Very well. Trial is set for next month. And Mr. Richardson? The judge's voice carried a warning. I suggest you use that time to reconsider the generous plea offer you just turned down. 3 weeks later, David sat in the county jail's law library, preparing for his trial. He had refused bail, wanting to experience the full weight of what other defendants faced. The experience had been educational in ways he never expected. He learned that the law library was only open 4 hours a day, 3 days a week. He learned that inmates had to request specific books days in advance, and many of the legal texts were outdated. He learned that preparing a defense while sharing a cell with 3 other men was nearly impossible. But David was nothing if not resourceful. He had spent 20 years learning the law, and he knew exactly what he needed to prove his innocence. More importantly, he knew how to make a dramatic point in court. On the morning of his trial, David was led into the same courtroom where he had watched dozens of other defendants receive unequal treatment. Judge Peterson sat behind the bench with the same tired authority, clearly expecting this to be a quick conviction. The gallery was fuller than usual. Word had spread through the legal community that someone was actually going to trial on resisting arrest charges, which almost never happened. A few reporters sat in the back rows, drawn by the unusual nature of a pro se defendant challenging police testimony. District Attorney Foster sat at the prosecution table with two thick files and a confident expression. She had built her career on winning cases like this one. Police officers almost always made credible witnesses, and juries almost always believed them over defendants. David wore the same orange jumpsuit he had worn to every court appearance. His hair was longer now, and he had grown a beard during his time in jail. He looked tired and worn down, exactly like what the court expected from someone who had spent a month in custody. "The state calls Officer Thompson," DA Foster announced. Officer Thompson took the stand with practiced confidence. He had testified in hundreds of cases over his 15-year career, and he knew exactly what prosecutors wanted to hear. "Officer Thompson, please describe the events of June 15th, Foster said. Thompson spoke clearly and professionally. "My partner and I observed the defendant speeding through a residential area at approximately 45 mph in a 35 mph zone. When we conducted the traffic stop, the defendant immediately became argumentative and hostile." David listened carefully, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. Thompson's testimony was smooth and rehearsed, but David knew something the officer didn't. The elderly woman across the street from where he was arrested had given him her phone number that day. She had recorded the entire incident. "What happened when you asked the defendant to step out of the vehicle?" Foster continued. "The defendant refused to comply and began making threats. He then reached for what appeared to be a weapon, which is when my partner and I drew our firearms for our safety." Thompson painted a picture of David as an aggressive, dangerous individual who had forced two peace officers to take defensive action. It was a story designed to justify everything that happened next. "And when you attempted to arrest the defendant, he physically resisted, forcing us to use necessary force to subdue him. Throughout the entire encounter, the defendant showed complete disrespect for law enforcement." DA Foster nodded with satisfaction. "Thank you, Officer Thompson." Judge Peterson looked at David expectantly. "Mr. Richardson, do you have any questions for this witness?" David stood up slowly. For 3 weeks, he had been treated as just another criminal by everyone in this building. Guards, other inmates, even the cleaning staff looked at him with a mixture of pity and disdain. Today, that was about to change. "Officer Thompson, you testified that I was going 45 mph in a 35 mph zone, correct?" "That's correct. Did you use radar to measure my speed?" Thompson hesitated slightly. "We observed the vehicle traveling at excessive speed. So you estimated my speed visually?" "Yes." David pulled out a folder from his legal materials. "Officer Thompson, are you familiar with the 800 block of Maple Street, where this incident occurred?" "Yes." "Would you describe it as a straight road or one with curves?" "It has some gentle curves." "And would you say visual speed estimation is as accurate on curved roads as on straight roads?" Thompson was beginning to look uncomfortable. "It can be challenging." David nodded and moved to his next point. "Officer Thompson, you testified that I became immediately argumentative and hostile. What exactly did I say that was argumentative?" "You questioned why you were being stopped." "Is asking questions considered argumentative behavior in your experience?" DeFoster stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is arguing with the witness." "Sustained," Judge Peterson said quickly. David smiled slightly. Even representing himself, he was being treated differently than the other defendants he had watched. "Officer Thompson, you said I appeared to reach for a weapon. What did I actually have in my hand?" "A cell phone." "Did I point this cell phone at you in a threatening manner?" "You attempted to record the encounter without permission." "Officer Thompson, are you aware that citizens have the legal right to record police interactions in public?" Thompson's confidence was starting to crack. That may be technically correct. So when I exercise my legal right to record our interaction, you interpreted this as a threat?" The movement appeared threatening in the moment. David walked back to his table and picked up another document. "Officer Thompson, in your report you stated that I physically resisted arrest. Can you describe this physical resistance? You tensed up and refused to comply. Did I strike you or your partner? No. Did I attempt to run away? No. Did I verbally threaten you in any way? Your entire demeanor was threatening. Judge Peterson was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the questioning. David could see that the judge was beginning to realize this wasn't going to be the simple conviction he expected. Officer Thompson, do you have your body camera footage from that day? Thompson glanced nervously at D.A. Foster. The camera malfunctioned, I see. And your partner's camera? Also malfunctioned. David nodded as if this was exactly what he expected to hear. Officer Thompson, in your 15 years of law enforcement, how often do both officers' body cameras malfunction simultaneously? I've heard it's rare, but technical equipment can fail. Thank you, Officer Thompson. No further questions. Judge Peterson called for a short recess. During the break, David noticed that D.A. Foster was whispering urgently with Officer Thompson. The confident atmosphere from the morning was gone. When court resumed, Foster called Officer Rodriguez, Thompson's partner. His testimony matched Thompson's almost word for word, but David noticed small inconsistencies that he planned to exploit. After both officers testified, D.A. Foster rested her case. She still looked confident, but there was something in her expression that suggested she was less certain than she had been that morning. Mr. Richardson, you may present your defense, Judge Peterson said. David stood up and walked to the center of the courtroom. The moment he had been planning for 3 weeks had finally arrived. Your Honor, before I call my first witness, I have something important to tell this court. He reached into his legal folder and pulled out his federal credentials and bar card, the items he had been carrying the day he was arrested, which had been returned to him that morning. My name is David Richardson, and I am the United States Attorney for the Eastern District. The courtroom erupted. D.A. Foster's face went completely white. Officer Thompson's mouth fell open. Judge Peterson stared at the credentials David was holding up, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to something approaching panic. Your Honor, David continued in the voice that had commanded federal courtrooms for 20 years. I have spent the last month experiencing firsthand the same injustices that my office works every day to combat. I have witnessed systemic bias that cannot be ignored, and I have documentation to prove everything I'm about to present. Judge Peterson's face was red. Mr. Richardson, David, I had no idea. I know you didn't, Judge Peterson. That's exactly the point. David walked back to his table and picked up a manila envelope. Your Honor, I would like to introduce into evidence a video recording of the entire traffic stop, recorded by Mrs. Eleanor Martinez, who lives at 847 Maple Street. The elderly woman who had recorded everything was sitting in the gallery, smiling. She had been waiting 3 weeks to see justice served. This recording will show that I was not speeding, that I was completely cooperative, and that both officers lied under oath about virtually every aspect of our encounter. D.A. Foster looked like she was about to be sick. Officer Thompson was staring at his hands, probably already thinking about whether he needed a lawyer. David looked directly at Judge Peterson. Your Honor, this case is about more than just my wrongful arrest. It's about a system that treats people differently based on their race, their economic status, and their ability to fight back. For the past month, I've seen how this system works when it thinks no one important is watching. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of reporters frantically taking notes. I request that all charges against me be dismissed, and I formally notify this court that my office will be conducting a comprehensive investigation into police practices in this county. Judge Peterson sat behind his bench, looking like a man who had just realized his career was about to take a very different direction. Mr. Richardson, Your Honor, I had no idea who you were. David's response was quiet but firm. I know, Judge Peterson, and that's exactly why this happened. The news broke within hours. By evening, every major news outlet in the country was running the story of the federal prosecutor who had gone undercover in his own justice system and exposed the bias that many had long suspected but few had been able to prove. David sat in his real office for the first time in a month, still adjusting to being back in his own clothes and his own world. The mahogany desk, the law books, the framed diplomas on the wall, everything looked the same. But he felt completely different. Catherine knocked on his office door, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the proud smile he had fallen in love with 20 years ago. "How does it feel to be famous?" she asked, setting 1 cup in front of him. David picked up the newspaper from his desk. The headline read, "U.S. Attorney Exposes Judicial Bias After Month in County Jail." Below, it was a photo of him in his orange jumpsuit standing next to a current photo in his prosecutor's robes. "It feels necessary," he said simply. The phone had been ringing constantly. Interview requests from CNN, NBC, and every major newspaper in the country. Congressional representatives wanting to schedule hearings. Civil rights organizations asking him to speak at conferences. The attention was overwhelming, but David knew it was exactly what needed to happen. Lisa walked into the office, still glowing from her recent bar exam passage. "Dad, I just wanted you to know how proud I am of what you did." David hugged his daughter tightly. "I kept thinking about you the whole time, about what kind of legal system I wanted you to inherit. It's going to be better because of what you did," Lisa said confidently. 3 days after the trial, David called a press conference. The federal courthouse steps were packed with reporters, cameras, and citizens who had heard about his experience and wanted to see what would happen next. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, his voice carrying the same authority it always had, but with a new edge born from personal experience. 3 weeks ago, I was just another defendant in orange jumpsuit, waiting to see if the system would treat me fairly. Today, I stand before you as someone who has seen our justice system from both sides, and I can tell you that what I witnessed cannot be ignored." He held up a thick folder. "This contains documentation of systematic disparities in sentencing, bail decisions, and case processing that I personally observed during my month in the county jail system. I watched identical charges receive dramatically different treatment based solely on the race and economic status of the defendants." The crowd was completely silent, hanging on every word. "Officer Thompson and Officer Rodriguez have been suspended pending a full investigation. Their body camera malfunctions have been revealed to be a pattern affecting dozens of arrests over the past 2 years. Judge Peterson has recused himself from all cases involving these officers and has requested additional training on unconscious bias." David paused, thinking about all the people he had met in jail whose stories would never make headlines. But this is about more than 2 officers and 1 judge. This is about a system that has allowed these disparities to exist unchallenged for too long. Effective immediately, my office is launching Operation Equal Justice, a comprehensive review of law enforcement practices throughout this district. Reporter hands shot up immediately. "Mr. Richardson, how many cases are you planning to review?" "Every arrest made by Officers Thompson and Rodriguez over the past 5 years. Every case that appeared before Judge Peterson during that same period. We will also be implementing new protocols for body camera maintenance and requiring annual bias training for all law enforcement agencies that work with federal prosecutors." "What about the other defendants you met in jail? Will they get new trials?" David's expression grew serious. "Robert Williams, who had been arrested 17 times for fitting a description, will have his case reviewed by independent prosecutors. Anthony Washington, the 17-year-old sentenced to 30 days for stealing a candy bar, will have his record expunged. Maria Gonzalez and 12 other defendants who received disproportionate sentences will have their cases reopened." Another reporter called out, "Some critics are saying you're using your position to get revenge. How do you respond?" David had expected this question. "I'm using my position to do what I should have been doing all along, ensuring equal justice under law. If I had done my job properly from the beginning, I never would have needed to experience the system as a defendant to understand how broken it was." After the press conference, David returned to his office to find a stack of letters waiting for him. They were from people across the country who had experienced similar treatment, but had never had anyone believe their stories. One letter was from a teacher in Detroit who had been arrested for suspicious behavior while jogging in his own neighborhood. Another was from a grandmother in Phoenix who had been handcuffed in front of her grandchildren during a traffic stop, where she had done nothing wrong. Letter after letter described encounters with law enforcement that followed the same pattern David had experienced. "We've created a monster," David said to Catherine that evening as they sat in their kitchen, reading through the correspondence. "No," Catherine corrected him. "You've finally seen the monster that was already there, and now you're in a position to do something about it." 6 months later, David testified before Congress about his experience. The hearing room was packed and his testimony was broadcast live on multiple networks. "Senator Williams, what did you learn from your month in jail that you couldn't have learned as a prosecutor?" asked the committee chair. David looked directly into the camera, knowing that his words would reach millions of people. "I learned that the system I had served faithfully for 20 years was two different systems depending on who you are. I learned that justice isn't blind. It sees race, it sees class, and it makes decisions accordingly. Most importantly, I learned that good intentions aren't enough. We need structural changes, accountability measures, and constant vigilance to ensure that equal protection under law means something more than just words on paper." The changes that followed were comprehensive. Body camera requirements became federal mandates. Bias training became mandatory for all federal law enforcement. A new civilian oversight board was established to investigate complaints of police misconduct. David's office successfully prosecuted 17 civil rights violations that had been previously overlooked. More importantly, the awareness created by his experience led to policy changes in courtrooms across the country. Judge Peterson, after completing extensive bias training, became an advocate for judicial reform. "David Richardson showed me things about my own courtroom that I had been blind to for 20 years, he said in an interview 6 months later. Every judge in America should spend a day watching their own courtroom from the defendant's perspective. A year after his arrest, David received the American Bar Association's Medal for Courageous Advocacy. In his acceptance speech, he said something that surprised everyone, including himself. "The most important case I ever prosecuted wasn't in federal court. It was in county court representing myself, fighting for the principle that justice should look the same, whether you're wearing a $1,000 suit or an orange jumpsuit." Lisa, now working as a public defender, was in the audience that night. As she watched her father receive the award, she thought about all the defendants she had represented who would benefit from the changes he had set in motion. David Richardson had gone to his daughter's graduation as a successful federal prosecutor who believed the system worked. He came home as someone who understood that making the system work required constant effort, personal sacrifice, and the courage to admit when you've been wrong. The orange jumpsuit he had worn was now framed in his office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Justice wasn't something that happened automatically. It was something that had to be fought for case by case, day by day, by people willing to risk everything to make sure it was real for everyone.